Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Most Southern Place on Earth, the Mississippi Delta and the Roots of Regional Identity, by James C. Cobb. Narrated by David Stifel. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. In May 1985, I appeared on a Center for the Study of Southern Culture videotape, standing in a cotton field on the outskirts of Marks, Mississippi, describing the Mississippi Delta as a land of astounding economic and social disparity, and declaring it the most southern place on earth. Although at the time I felt terribly pleased with the cleverness and originality of my observation, I soon learned that I was actually but one of a host of commentators who over the years have treated the Mississippi Delta as an isolated, time-warped enclave, whose startling juxtaposition of white affluence and black poverty suggested the Old South's legacy, preserved in vivid microcosm. Since my undergraduate days, I had envisioned the Mississippi Delta as the distilled essence of the Deep South, the last stronghold of the plantation, and the only place in Dixie where cotton would always be king. Before I came to the University of Mississippi in 1981, however, my actual knowledge of the Delta was by no means extensive. When I arrived in Oxford, I was uncertain even of the area's exact location, although I soon learned that the Mississippi Delta is actually the Yazoo Mississippi Delta, and is not the true delta of the Mississippi, but the common floodplain of the Yazoo and Mississippi rivers. Only later would I encounter David Cohen's oft-quoted and occasionally plagiarized insistence that the Mississippi Delta begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and ends on Catfish Row in Vicksburg. Further investigation on my part would reveal that as an exercise in physical geography, Cohen's identification of the northern and southern termini of the Delta was somewhat imprecise. When it came to cultural geography, however, Cohen's description of the symbolic socio-economic extremities of the Delta proved to be right on the mark. Cohen stressed the uniqueness of his native Delta, describing it as a strange and detached fragment thrown off by the whirling comet that is America. And sure enough, I soon noticed that in Mississippi, one spoke not of going to Clarksdale, Greenville, or Greenwood, but of traveling into the Delta, the implication being that of passage back in time, to a setting that, if such a thing were possible, seemed even more southern than the rest of the state. The more I read and observed, the social self-assurance and fraternity and sorority row prominence of Ole Miss's Delta-bred white students, the refusal of a Delta Civic Club to accept a black faculty colleague as a luncheon speaker, the well-publicized contrasts between poverty and affluence in the Delta's notorious Tunica County, the literary and musical creativity that abounded in the area, the more convinced I became that the story of the Delta might afford the opportunity to study in sharply defined geographical miniature the rich history and culture of the Deep South. Fueled by exuberance and restrained by neither significant research nor serious reflection, I proceeded at this point to offer my cotton patch exposition on the Delta's intense and uniquely enduring southernness. Although I was hardly alone in making such an assessment, as my research progressed, I grew to regret my impressionistic observations, not because I had exaggerated the Delta's southernness, but because I had oversimplified and to some extent trivialized it. The Delta that ultimately emerged from my study was no mere isolated backwater where time stood still while southernness stood fast. Indeed, Many of the major economic, political, and social forces that have swept across the American landscape during the last 150 years have actually converged in the Mississippi Delta. Although it would one day come to symbolize the Old South, with only 10% of its land cleared in 1860, the Yazoo Delta was little more than a sparsely inhabited plantation frontier as the antebellum era drew to a close. Its inexhaustible soils and year-round work demands made the Delta an optimum environment for large-scale cotton cultivation and the employment of slave labor. But although it seemed like the answer to every planter's prayers, the oft-flooded, thickly forested Delta's formidable physical disadvantages effectively reserved its tremendous wealth-producing potential for those with the sizable labor and capital or credit resources necessary to exploit it. The upheaval of the Civil War and Reconstruction destroyed the Delta's prospects as a large slaveholder's paradise and confronted its planters with the reality of their dependence on a huge black labor force, suddenly free to exert its newfound economic leverage and exercise its recently acknowledged political rights as well. In 1875, the desire of whites in the Delta and throughout Mississippi to regain control of their labor and reassert white political supremacy manifested itself in the violent, unlawful, but ultimately successful effort to redeem the state from Republican rule. Redemption brought no immediate restoration of planter hegemony in the economic or political arenas, however. Freedmen continued to use demand for their labor to secure more advantageous terms from their employers, while their participation in biracial fusion arrangements raised questions about the future of white political supremacy as well. Not until the 1880s, when federally funded levee rehabilitation and privately financed railroad expansion triggered a land and population boom, did the region begin to reclaim its antebellum identity as the undisputed domain of the planter. By the turn of the century, self-styled planter aristocrats once again presided over the Mississippi Delta. But for all their pretensions, these planters were a far cry from the stereotypical squires who inhabit the Old South legend. Even in the antebellum era, successful Delta planters had been far more concerned about matters of profits and costs than their seigneurial heirs seemed to suggest. But the Delta's New South planter elite were considerably more sophisticated and dynamic than their antebellum predecessors had been. They not only stood ready to court federal funds, as well as northern and foreign investment capital in the interest of the overall development of the Delta's economy, but they embraced and adapted theories and strategies of management and supervision modeled after those currently in fashion in the industrial North. Meanwhile, soaring land prices, disfranchisement, and a socially and legally imposed redefinition of sharecropping that effectively reduced croppers to wage laborers enabled Delta planters to regain control over their black workers. With a comprehensive and rigidly enforced system of caste further guaranteeing their dominance, the Delta's white elite entered the 20th century presiding over a social order reminiscent of the Old South, while adhering to an economic philosophy rooted firmly in the New. The New Deal brought major changes to the Delta's economy, but the region's white leadership drew on its experience in manipulating federal relief during the 1927 flood and managed to use many New Deal programs to sustain and even strengthen its socio-economic and political grip on the Delta. World War II brought a massive dislocation of labor and induced considerable social ferment, but the ability of Delta whites to utilize their continuing influence over federal agencies and programs proved crucial to their efforts to resist the rising civil rights pressures and black political challenges of the 1960s and 1970s. Only in the 1980s did Delta blacks begin to gain political influence consistent with their numerical strength. and even then it was by no means clear whether blacks were actually capturing political control or whites were simply surrendering it, effectively abdicating any responsibility for the leadership of an economically depressed Delta sustained primarily by federal life support systems and threatening to become little more than a vast rural ghetto. The foregoing overview by no means suggests that my original perception of the Delta as a potential window on the historical and cultural experience of the Deep South was inaccurate. The Delta's story incorporates numerous elements crucial to understanding the broad sweep of Southern history. It begins with the westward spread of slavery and affords an excellent perspective on the operation of large-scale slave estates, as well as the economic and social implications of emancipation, Reconstruction, and the emergence of postbellum plantation tenancy. In the wake of these developments came disfranchisement and the imposition of an inflexible and remarkably effective system of repression and racial control. The Delta also provides a superb setting for studying the effects of the New Deal and subsequent federal farm, relief, and welfare programs on the South. The region was on the front lines of the civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s, and witnessed the gradual expansion of black political influence in the 1970s and 1980s. The post-New Deal Delta's economic transformation and the struggle to create non-agricultural opportunities for its impoverished and undereducated black population reflect the recent experience of much of the rural and small-town South. As the cradle of the blues and the greatest single sub-regional contributor to the stream of Southern black migrants to the urban North, the Delta was indeed, as Tony Dunbar observed, a primary taproot of black culture and history in America. Finally, as a remarkably rich source of inspiration to writers and artists of various sorts, the Delta's socio-economic and cultural milieu may hold the keys to a better understanding of the flowering of creativity that sparked the post-World War I Southern literary renaissance. Like the South at large, the Delta presented a fascinating saga of continuity amid change, but if its story was certifiably Southern, it was by no means exclusively so. Despite its image as an isolated Old South enclave holding out to the last against the besetting forces of change, the Delta's post-bellum experience has been characterized by close and consistent interaction with prevailing national and international economic influences and trends. Although its white leaders dedicated themselves to the maintenance of the social and political status quo within the region, since the Redemption era, they have worked assiduously to promote the Delta's economic expansion and secure its effective integration into the world and national economy. For more than a century, socioeconomic and political conditions in the Delta have reflected no more formative influence than that of the programs and policies of the federal government, and at no time during the 20th century has the Delta been without at least one powerful and influential voice in Washington. In 1990, Tony Dunbar wrote of a struggle between powerful forces from outside the Delta and a deep cultural bedrock that refuses to give way. No visitor who observes the corporate-owned mega-plantations, shiny new Walmarts, or video rental outlets housed in old plantation commissaries is likely to quibble with Dunbar's up-close assessment of the contemporary scene. On the other hand, to take a longer view and survey the entire historical experience of the region is to discover that powerful forces from outside the Delta have often reinforced rather than undermined its resistance to change. In fact, much of what Dunbar and a host of others have seen as a simple indigenous cultural bedrock is actually the multi-layered and remarkably complex long-term historical product of the Delta's interaction with a variety of external influences. Lawrence Levine has argued that culture is less a fixed condition than a process, the product of interaction between past and present. In Levine's view, therefore, cultural persistence depends less on the ability to defend the status quo than the capacity to react creatively and responsively to the realities of a new situation. If Levine is correct, it is time to rethink the familiar concept of Southern culture as a freestanding set of exotic and immutable beliefs, rituals, and relationships, mysteriously persisting in outright defiance of the powerful, innovative influences of American mass society. As Emanuel Wallerstein has observed, the problem with this traditional approach is that it forces one's vision inward. My experience in studying the Delta suggests the need to do just the opposite, to look outward and re-examine the South's socioeconomic and cultural characteristics within the context of its interactions with, rather than its isolation from, the larger national and global setting. Approached in this fashion, the Delta became a part of the world rather than a world apart, a place where questions about the heart and soul of a region often produced answers about the conscience and character of a nation as well. Townsend, Tennessee, March 1992. JCC. Introduction. Pure soil, endlessly deep, dark, and sweet. Approximately 15,000 years ago, during the final cycle of worldwide glaciation, the Mississippi River and its tributaries cut deep valleys within the lower Gulf coastal plain. As the glaciers melted and the level of the sea around the mouth of the Mississippi rose, these engorged and sediment-laden streams backed up, flooding the lower Mississippi valleys over an area as much as 80 miles wide at some points, and covering them with a thick coating of alluvium drained from a land area encompassing what now amounts to 41% of the continental United States. One of the many basins marking the irregular surface of this vast alluvial bed is the Yazoo Mississippi Delta, which is actually more diamond or oval than deltoid in shape. The Mississippi River, which runs southwestward from Memphis to Greenville, where it then bends slightly eastward toward Vicksburg, forms the western boundary of the area. On the east, the Yazoo Delta is defined by a line of bluffs, some reaching 200 feet in height. These bluffs run from slightly below Memphis south to Greenwood, and thence southwesterly along the Yazoo River, which meets the Mississippi at Vicksburg. The Yazoo Mississippi Delta is approximately 200 miles long and 70 miles across at its widest point. The area within its boundaries is approximately 7,110 square miles. Although it appears flat to the naked eye, the surface of the delta is actually the somewhat uneven result of centuries of flooding and sedimentation by the Mississippi and its tributaries. When confined to its normal channel, the Mississippi dumped its rich load of silt in its true delta at its mouth. During floods, however, when the great stream climbed out of its channel, it also slowed and lost more of its suspended soils to its expanded bed. Its first losses were its heavier, coarser soils, which accumulated near the normal riverbed, while the lighter, finer particles were not deposited until the rising waters reached further inland. In a typical late winter and spring, before white settlers tried to tame the river with levees, the Mississippi, swelled by rapidly melting snows that had blanketed the area to the north, would also cause the waters of the Yazoo and its tributaries to rise, thereby flooding the surrounding lowlands, and triggering a similar, though scaled-down, flooding effect along the backed-up feeder streams of the Yazoo. With slightly over 50% of its rainfall occurring in the months from December to May, when the Mississippi and its tributaries were already most likely to be at their highest levels, flooding, with the accompanying deposit of fertile organic material, was but part of a natural recurrent cycle of life in the delta. The Yazoo Delta, wrote David L. Cohen, was the land of the loins of the river. It had sprung from the body of the Mississippi in a gestation eons long. Untold centuries ago, it began to deposit here rich detritus of mountains and plains borne on its bosom, as it flowed from the north to the south to sea. Accretion by slow accretion, without foundation of rock or shale, it laid down this land, pure soil, endlessly deep, dark, and sweet. The basin's humid subtropical climate nurtured a lush blanket of vegetation on this rich land that the river had built. Cypress, tupelo, and sweet gums, averaging 4 to 6 feet in diameter, dominated forests also dotted with sycamore, poplar, pecan, maple, hickory, walnut, ash, hackberry, black gum, cottonwood, honey locust, and slash pine. Between these trees spread what William Alexander Percy envisioned as a chaos of vines and cane and brush. As the centuries passed, flood after flood spread blankets of rich alluvium over accumulating layers of decomposing vegetation, and the delta's soil only grew richer. Taken as a whole, reported a geologist from the delta in 1906, the plant food percentages in this soil are probably unexcelled by any soil in the world thus far examined. Disturbed but little by the mound-building Indians who dwelt primarily on the sedimented high ground along the banks of rivers and streams, the rich delta jungle was slumbering still when Hernando de Soto began an excursion from Florida to the Mississippi in 1539. De Soto claimed the area, including the Yazoo Delta, for Spain, but the Spanish made no effort to establish settlements in the southern coastal portions of Mississippi, and the Delta continued its sleep. At the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the Yazoo Delta fell into British hands as a result of the general cession of French lands required by the Peace of Paris in 1763. The British promptly declared most of the area part of the Illinois Territory, and therefore off-limits to white settlers. The territory passed to the United States at the end of the Revolutionary War. Georgia's claim to all the lands between it and the Mississippi River led to abortive attempts by land speculators to promote the settlement of this area. But the way was not fully clear for white occupation on a significant scale until the United States organized the Mississippi Territory in 1798. Among the handful of whites who actually visited the Delta at this point, none disputed the incredible fertility of its soil. Neither, however, was any observer unaware of the formidable physical challenges posed by the oft-flooded Delta wilderness. As early as the 1720s, when the lower Mississippi Valley still lay in the hands of the French, the area already enjoyed a reputation as what one scholar described as a seething, lush hell. One traveler who passed through the Delta in 1805 or 1806 reported in his diary that all the country, or nearly so between the Yazoo and the Mississippi to the mouth of the Yazoo, overflows annually and renders it of no value. Writing in his Emigrant's Directory in 1817, Samuel Brown predicted great things for the Fourth Chickasaw Bluff, destined to become the site of a handsome town, and for Walnut Hills at the southern end of the basin. Memphis and Vicksburg eventually vindicated his optimism, but even the zealous and imaginative Brown found it difficult to conjure up much of a future for the swampy interior wilderness of a delta that lay covered with forests and impervious and wide-spreading canebrakes. Given the preponderance of such testimony, it was hardly surprising that even after Mississippi gained statehood in 1817, the rich, dark alluvial soil of the Delta continued to lie, in Cohen's words, as in a dream, awaiting the arrival of those who would rip it from the passionate embrace of deep-rooted trees and close-clinging vines and exploit its richness to the fullest. Chapter 1. Plantation Frontier. Early travelers' accounts did not exaggerate the difficulties inherent in clearing and settling such a swampy wilderness. But those who wrote off the Yazoo Mississippi Delta's long-term prospects for development failed to appreciate the importance that the remarkable fertility of its continually replenished alluvial soil would assume in a regional, national, and international economy grown ravenous for cotton. More than that, however, those who doubted that the Delta could ever be cleared, tamed, and farmed efficiently failed to take into account the determination, rapacity, and cruelty that humans could exhibit if the proper incentives were in place. Scarcely 3 decades after Mississippi joined the Union, though still a largely uncleared wilderness, the Yazoo Basin had already emerged as the most attractive new planting region in the Cotton South. When Mississippi became the nation's 20th state in 1817, the Delta region was still in the hands of the Choctaw. White migration to other areas of Mississippi soon generated pressure for Indian removal, which was accomplished in a series of 3 treaties between 1820 and 1832. The Treaty of Doak's Stand in 1820 marked the sale of part of the southwestern holdings of the Choctaw. These lands were quickly organized into Hinds County. Hinds begat Yazoo in 1823, and 5 years later, Washington County, which then included much of the Yazoo Delta, was carved from Yazoo and the part of Warren County north of Vicksburg. Elsewhere within the Yazoo Basin, Bolivar, Coahoma, and Tunica counties were formed in 1836, and Issaquena and Sunflower were created in 1884. Initial settlement in the Yazoo region was concentrated primarily on or near the Mississippi River. The most impenetrable interior of the basin presented would-be pioneers with too many obstacles, and except for the high banks of a few interior streams and the Lake Washington area south of the present site of Greenville, it was virtually unpopulated. The first white settlers who came to the area probably arrived between 1825 and 1827. One such pioneer was Junius Ward of Kentucky, who traveled down the Natchez Trace and, after hearing of a beautiful lake in the Yazoo wilderness, persuaded some Choctaws to take him there. Ward determined to locate on the banks of what would become Lake Washington. He returned the next year, bringing his slaves down the Mississippi by flatboat and building a raft to carry his possessions up a bayou to his new lakeside home. When he arrived, he found he already had a neighbor in Princeton engineering graduate Frederick Turnbull, who had constructed a flatboat and floated up a bayou to the lake. Turnbull surveyed his land, built a cabin, and left, returning the following year with his family, his remaining slaves, and other possessions. The accounts of Ward's and Turnbull's settlement near the lake illustrated the isolated frontier conditions that prevailed in the Mississippi Delta in the 1820s. Because there were no roads, both chose locations that provided access by a water route to the Mississippi, where they could connect via steamboat with the outside world. The Lake Washington area soon became a magnet for others, as early settlers convinced friends and relatives to move to the Delta. Despite the almost universal tendency to associate the conquest of the frontier with the hard-working, upwardly mobile yeoman farmer, the Delta was destined from the beginning to be the domain of substantial planters. Pioneers with means, as David Cohen described them, who possessed both the financial resources and the slaves required to clear and drain the land and take full advantage of its fertility. By 1830, Washington County's population stood at 1,976, of whom 1,184 were slaves. Swelled by purchase, natural increase, and immigration, the slave population continued to multiply, increasing almost 6-fold between 1830 and 1840. In the latter year, there were already more than 10 slaves for every white in Washington County. By 1850, this ratio would stand at 14.5 to 1. Individual slaveholdings expanded rapidly. Andrew Turnbull, who owned 26 slaves in 1830,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?